Bonjour tout le monde and welcome to week 7 of Turn Back the Clock with Stock. We're going to start today on October 4th, 1880. We had the death of Jacques Offenbach. Now he was a French composer who wrote many things, but his most famous work is Orpheus in the Underworld, also known as Orpheus aux Enfers. I put a link in the description. Go check it out. I'm pretty sure that you've heard it. If you don't want to listen to the whole thing, start at minute 7 and 20 seconds. On October 5th, some very important things happened during the French Revolution. In 1789, you had Parisian women marching on Versailles to protest the price of bread. Now, this is when we got Marie Antoinette's very famous line, "Let them eat cake." What Marie Antoinette didn't understand is that these women were protesting not simply the fact that they didn't have bread, but they didn't have the money to buy a necessity like bread. And Marie Antoinette said, well, if they don't have bread, why don't they eat cake? Well, they couldn't, because if they don't have the money for the necessities, they didn't have the money for frivolities. So it showed that disconnect between Marie Antoinette and what was really happening, and that really added some fuel to the French Revolution. In 1793, you had the revolutionary calendar established, and also Christianity was abolished in France. Now, the reason for this is because it was the church that crowned the king. And since the people were overthrowing the king, they had to overthrow the church as well, because obviously those two were in cahoots. What the people soon realized was that it's easier to change your government than it is to change your faith. So the faith came back fairly easily, fairly quickly, but it still took a while for them to establish their own republican government. Also on October 6th, in 1887, we have the birth of Le Corbusier. Now, he was an architect who wanted to create better living conditions in crowded urban cities. And because of this, he helped create a city in India named Chandigarh. He designed a lot of apartment buildings, business buildings, individual homes, and also a lot of churches. And I've included some images for those. On October 7th, 1337, Edward III claims the throne of France, denying Philip VI legitimacy. Now, this was at the beginning of the 100 Years' War. Philip VI should have been the true French leader, but Edward III was the British leader who claimed the throne. On October 7th, 1948, we had the presentation of the 2CV at the 35th Salon de l'Automobile. Now, the 2CV is a classic French car. It almost looks like a VW Beetle, but not quite. It's just one of those classic automobiles that you say, there's a French car. And you'll still see them every now and then in France. On October 9th, 272, this is one of my most favorite things in all of French history. We have the death of Saint Denis. Now, Saint Denis is the patron saint of France, and during this time, France was not Christian. So he was going around spreading the Christian gospel, and because of that, he was sentenced to death. Death at that time was beheading, not by guillotine. That wouldn't come around for another 1,500 years or so. But there was a chopping block on the north side of Paris. And by chopping block, I mean chopping block. Your head was chopped off with either an axe or a sword. So he's being led up to the chopping block, led up to the execution site, and he's still preaching all the way up the hill. So the guards who were taking him up, they don't like it any more than their leader did, so they chopped his head off right there. Legend has it that instead of dying, Saint Denis picked up his head, walked back down the mountain, showed it to everyone in the crowd who had gathered. Executions at that time were kind of like a sporting event. People brought lunches and their children and met their friends there. So he picked up his head, showed it to everyone, walked about 2 miles, showing his face to anyone he encountered. Finally, he came upon a fountain where he washed off his face and then collapsed and died. Now, if this truly happened, you can imagine what sort of impression it would make among these people. And that was the start of Christianity in France. Saint Denis' image is used in a lot of art, architecture. It's used all over the place, actually. There is a church on the north side of Paris called Saint Denis, and that is where every king of France is buried. On October 10th, 1732, we had the Battle of Tours, where Charles Martel, also known as Charles the Hammer, he defeats the Moors. Now, the Moors were essentially gypsies who had come across the Sinai Peninsula through northern Africa, across the Straits of Gibraltar into Spain, and then they were crossing the Pyrenees into France. And Charles Martel said, I will not have these non-Christians in my Christian kingdom. So he waged battle and he pushed the Moors out of France. Now it would be his grandson, Charlemagne, who would actually push the Moors out of Spain. But until then, Charles Martel, he established Christianity as the religion of France, and he would not allow the Moors in there. Also on October 10th in 1684, we had the birth of painter Antoine Watteau in Valenciennes. Now, Watteau revitalized the use of color and movement in paintings, and he helped transition from the Baroque period into the Rococo period. I am not a fan of anything Baroque or Rococo. Sorry, Aunt Louise, I'm just not. Look them up if you want. I'm not a fan, so that's all I'll say. One last thing, on October 10th, 2015, my good friends Ryan and Taryn are getting married, and I'm really looking forward to being there and sharing that day with them. Best of luck to you guys. Okay, that's it for French history, and I will see you next week. A bientôt! Yeah!